Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. This is Orphan Last, aka Skylar Madison, and today I'm going to be creating a 3D grease pencil concept image for a science fiction fighter, and then I'm going to go ahead and 3D model it in this speed sculpting video. Now, there are ways of directly translating your 3D grease pencil sketch over to being a 3D model, but I guess the specifics on that technique kind of elude me. I did check out a couple of videos on it on YouTube. One of those videos didn't really talk about what was advertised, and then the other one was about 2 hours long, and the person doing the demonstration had really poor sound quality and a really strong accent that I couldn't really follow very well. And it's really hard to commit to something like that when already there are 15-minute long Blender tutorials and they're already phased out 6 months after they've already been introduced. As much as I do love the fact that Blender is finally getting the love and development that it's been needing, the user interface overhaul, new features and all of that, it does come at a price where you'll follow a tutorial for a really long time. Even a 15-minute long video will take you, if you're following it, maybe about an hour long to follow, and then they'll tell you to press some magical button that, when pressed,
some magical stuff will happen.
But since the interface is getting some major overhauls even still today, that button may no longer even exist, and you've just wasted all of that time following a tutorial that just ultimately led to a dead end. I was wanting to put a comic book shader on this model as well, but I wound up running into a few issues, and some of those issues stem from my inexperience, and some of the issues also are what I just barely described. For one, I'm not all too familiar with the node interface inside of Blender, and it's something that I'd like to get into, but something about it is just really intimidating, and I haven't really explored it that much. The second issue was that most of the tutorials instructed that I delete the principal shader, which, when done, it just got rid of all of the materials that I had actually spent quite a bit of time putting onto the ship. And I didn't like the idea of having to go back from the start and starting from scratch when it came to applying my materials. So if I left the principal shader on and still followed the tutorial, only one of the materials that I applied to the ship would wind up having the changes that I desired. And all of the other materials applied to the same collection, I guess, wound up remaining the same. And since I'm not all that familiar with the node interface, I have no idea of how to apply the comic book shader to all of the materials individually. Whereas one of the other tutorials wound up working out just fine, except for one of the very last steps was for me to basically press a magical button that just no longer exists, and everything would just look perfect. And that button doesn't exist, and so again, it just led me into a complete dead end. It kind of made me feel like Michael Scott from The Office when Jim and Pam go on their honeymoon, and Jim is on the phone pretending that he was losing signal, saying every other word and ending with,
"And then you'll be saved."
And then he hangs up. So adding a comic book filter just wasn't really an option for this project, I guess. So I guess in my case, the Mafia wound up winning. Now, although I always get jazzed when I'm working with Blender because I'm making something really cool and it's three-dimensional, and maybe down the road I might be able to 3D print this thing, especially when I nail down the entire workflow much better, I also wind up feeling a bit frustrated with what I want to accomplish versus what I actually know about the software, and trying to find some sort of happy middle ground between the two. Now, much of what I do when modeling the ship is I'm just grabbing a cube and working with a low-poly workflow to shape that cube to the desired shape that I need. The only thing that I always seem to regret is when I press Ctrl-B in order to bevel an object. That is the most frustrating thing. So later on, I wound up needing to reconstruct the mesh quite a bit before applying a subdivision surface modifier. Generally, I tend to be a firm believer in the subdivision surface modifier and working in concert with the bevel modifier, and just working with those non-destructive bevel tools. That just seems to work so much better for me. Even though there's a few issues that I still run into with that, it's non-destructive, and so that seems to work for me. And although the subdivision surface modifier does tend to make your mesh really dense with tons of vertices all over the place, I do think that's starting to matter less and less and less as time wears on. Like, if I wanted to make this for a video game, some of the game engines that are coming out right now are working with extremely dense topology, where vertices are placed nearly just a pixel apart from one another, and they're able to get the game to run rather smoothly regardless. And I don't know how they've accomplished that, but that's just absolutely amazing, where such high detailed rendering can happen in real time. So I don't think having a lower poly mesh is really going to necessarily matter or even be a necessity in the near future, or even in the next few decades, I think. I mean, if it's not in the next generation of gaming engines, then maybe the next one after that, it'll just matter even less and less and less after that. Which means that maybe the learning curve to working in those kinds of industries will wind up getting lowered as time goes on, and the workload winds up becoming less and less because of it, which to me just sounds freaking awesome. But if you happen to be someone that works in the industry and you happen to be more knowledgeable about this, feel free to let me know. I'd love to hear and learn more about this topic, because what I've been seeing specifically from the Unreal Engine is just kind of mind-blowing. I recently saw a Blender video where an experienced Blender user gave some advice that I found really helpful and even encouraging. He said that if you're new to using Blender, don't try to make everything perfect, but just strive to do your best. Don't let perfection get in the way of you making something cool, because if you're trying to make everything perfect all of the time, you're just never going to want to use Blender. And so that's a bit of advice that I wound up using for this project. So the topology might not be perfect, but generally I wound up perfecting it enough to the point to where I felt like the model was serviceable for my purposes, and to the point to where I got rid of most or all of the shading issues. And by and large, this is a solid object that won't be receiving any type of rigging or anything like that, and it won't be undergoing a bunch of warping to its geometry. And so, like I said, it seems like it'll serve my purposes just fine. Specifically, this is an asset for the Galactic Ring, which, for those of you that haven't been following my channel that closely, the Galactic Ring is a Creative Commons intellectual property that I've been working on and creating that'll eventually wind up becoming a comic book series that I'll be working on part-time here and there. And this fighter is going to be an asset that I'll be using somewhat frequently in that process, in creating this comic book. So ultimately, the perfection of the mesh isn't as important for my purposes. Ultimately, my ability to illustrate it is what's important. And I think that's not a bad place to start when you're starting out with Blender. If you're more of a 2D artist, like an illustrator and such like that, and you're just wanting to create assets to help you in either your own creative work when dealing with 2D illustrations and stuff, or in having assets for commission work down the road, and you don't necessarily know everything about Blender, yeah, I just think that's a good place to start. Maybe down the road, as you start learning more and more about Blender, maybe you could perfect those older models a bit more down the road. Because although you'll do your best to make a usable asset, your main focus is in creating an asset for illustration, and that's ultimately what my main focus is on, the illustration part, and just having an asset to help me visualize things in 3 dimensions a little bit better. And for those of you that have been following what I've been saying about the Galactic Ring, you might be wondering why I'm creating a science fiction fighter, because as far as I'm concerned, there will never be a hyperspace FTL faster than light or warp drive inside of the Galactic Ring. The only way people are able to travel from one star system to another is by going through the Galactic Ring itself. But that doesn't mean that there will never be anything like space battles inside of the Galactic Ring. Sometimes the Galactic Ring will open up into the vacuum of space and into something like an asteroid belt that's rich with valuable resources. And there's a civilization inside of the book so far that uses a little fighter jets to fly around in space as well as inside of an atmosphere. And so that's why I'm working on this specific model right now. Now, if you'd like to get your hands on this model, it'll be posted in my Galactic Ring Brainstorm channel in my Discord server. So if you'd like to get your hands on this model, and if you'd want to improve upon it and give it back to me and my community, then that'd be kind of cool and greatly appreciated. And thank you in advance for your support for doing that, if you choose to do that in wanting to collaborate with me in some sort of way. Just make sure that somewhere on the document, you wind up documenting that you worked on the model. Just please don't try to go using it for any other intellectual property than the Galactic Ring. So again, if you'd like to get your hands on this model and tinker with it or improve upon it in some way, you can get your hands on it on my Discord server. A link to my Discord server is in the video description below. Now, briefly, I'd like to talk about what I'm hoping to accomplish for the next week's video, since I have a little bit more time to speak. For the last couple years, I've been taking quite a bit of photos of things that I've been using as references for what I do for my day job. And for the longest time, I've been thinking that these images would be really helpful in the process of creating illustrations and maybe as a brush pack. And so that's what I'm thinking about working on, creating a bit of a brush pack for Clip Studio Paint and all that good stuff. I'm also thinking that I'll be changing up what I've set up for my Patreon so that I'll be working less like a subscription model and more like an actual tip jar where someone can throw me $1 to $10 and just once and one time alone, if they so choose, and maybe get their hands on a few of my illustrations and maybe this brush pack that I'm thinking I'll be working on for the next week. And from what I hear, Clip Studio Paint has recently been updated so that it can work with Photoshop brushes. And if that's the case, does anyone know if that means that I can save it as a Photoshop brush pack? I think that's what it means. Because if that's the case, then that means that it would be compatible with not just Clip Studio Paint, but Photoshop, Affinity products, as well as even Krita. If the creation of this brush pack winds up being beneficial enough, and I can see that there's some sort of demand for it, then I think I might work on making more intricate and more interesting brushes in the future. I don't know, just feel free to let me know if you're interested in that in the comment section below. And of course, now the final model is coming up onto the screen right now, and here it is. I think it looks kind of cool. I'm actually kind of happy with this. And once again, if you'd like to get your hands on it, tinker with it, maybe even modify and improve the topology if you so choose to, and give it back to me or my community, and maybe even offer up some sort of advice about how I could do better in the future, then I'm all ears, and I welcome the support, and it would be much appreciated if you happen to be more experienced and would like to collaborate with me with the Galactic Ring. Anyways, guys, that pretty much concludes it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. And if you guys would like to get more notifications from me, feel free to join my Discord server. A link to my Discord server is in the video description below. And if you'd like to support my channel, there's an image of a t-shirt in the upper right corner of the screen right now. It leads to my Teespring, and you can go ahead and purchase a t-shirt if you so choose. Any support would be much appreciated. And if you've enjoyed this content and would like to see more, feel free to click on anything else that's appearing on the screen right now. Thank you very much for your time.